Welcome to another episode of Understanding Items. This week we're going to take a look at Orchid, an often purchased item with tons of nuance. Orchid is an item that has an easy build-up, strong stats, as well as a strong but counterable active. It costs 4,075 gold, made up of 2 Oblivion staffs, each containing a quarterstaff, Robe of the Magi, and Sage's Mask, and finally a 775 gold recipe to finish up the Orchid. When completed, it gives you plus 25 intelligence, plus 30 attack speed, plus 30 damage, and plus 150% mana regeneration. That means for intelligence heroes, it gives plus 55 damage and plus 30 attack speed, a huge amount for 4,075 gold. But what about the active? Well, the active is one of the main reasons to purchase the item. Using Orchid on an enemy will silence them for 5 seconds, meaning they can't cast any spells while they're silenced. And at the end of the 5 seconds, they are dealt an additional 30% of the damage taken during the 5 seconds as a magic nuke. The primary benefit of the item is certainly the silence part, but in the early and mid parts of the game, some amplified damage can certainly be a big boon, especially when the item itself provides attack speed and damage as well. Silences are great disables because they prevent heroes from activating the abilities they need to kill or to stay alive when you gank them. So if you have trouble ensuring kills on important heroes or their abilities are giving you a lot of issues, Orchid can be a great solution for that problem. There are very few Dota heroes who can silence opponents, and fewer items that provide disables like stuns and silences. For the heroes missing the ability to prevent their opponent from reacting to your gank, Orchid can be a great purchase so that they can't stop you from killing them. There are further few Dota items that disable your opponents, and a large majority of them are slows, which often won't do the job. Out of all the items in the shop, here's the items that do provide some disable. The items at the top only provide slows, some of them attack speed and movement speed, some only movement speed, and Helm of the Dominator can provide a stun, but that's only if you dominate a creep with a stun, so we're going to leave that out. And of the remaining items, you should only buy Basher and Abyssal as a melee hero, so we're left with Orchid, a silence, Scythe of Eyes, a hex similar to a stun, and Yules, which doesn't allow you to damage your opponents when they're disabled. Even putting E-Blade and Heaven's Halberd into this list of disabling items is a stretch, since E-Blade makes the target ethereal and unable to attack, due to being in that state, but they can still cast spells during that, and Heaven's Halberd disarms them, making them unable to attack, but they can still cast spells, so they're not really true disables. So that's one of the things that makes Orchid special as an item. It's an item that actually provides a disable, which is very rare. It's not very expensive, and it will help you kill your opponents during ganks. The problem is that it's very counterable as a form of disable. And that's because silences are removable by weak dispels. There are a good handful of heroes who have dispel removing skills and items, but in Orchid's defense, the silence will at least prevent a player from using their skill to dispel their own hero. However, any hero purchasing Manta Style, Black King Bar, Yule Scepter, Lotus Orb, or Guardian Greaves, for example, they can use that item to remove the silence from themselves. You can even avoid some aspects of the Orchid disable with items like Glimmer Cape, Force Staff, Ghost Scepter, or Blink Dagger, which will at least get you away from the enemy while silenced, reduce the damage taken during the silence, or buy you some time until the silence ends so that you can actually use your spells to defend yourself. So while buying a 4,075 gold Orchid is great for intelligence, damage, attack speed, mana regen, and the active silence, there are a handful of inexpensive defensive items around 2,000 gold that counter it, and some more moderately expensive gold items that hard counter it. And that's a big weakness to Orchid. In the Midas episode, we talked about how Midas adjusts your power curve later into the game. With Orchid, this is often what makes or breaks the item. In many cases, you need to have your Orchid finished before your opponent gets their defensive item, or Orchid just isn't going to do much. The earlier you pick up your Orchid, the more opportunities you will have to secure kills with a weak disable like the Orchid Silence. If your Orchid is delayed because you are ganked or lose the early game, then your Orchid turns into an overly expensive damage and mana stick that is countered by a Manta Style or a Black King Bar, at least for the heroes who were able to purchase those items in time. Let's talk about heroes to purchase Orchid on that can make it work. The most common is probably Storm Spirit because he needs a lot of mana regen and intelligence. He loves the attack speed and the damage are great as well. And also having a silence to prevent gank responses really helps the hero to get kills and snowball harder. Queen of Pain is another example because she has a lot of damage and a great right click, but she has no natural disable other than a weak slow, so having a silence and damage amp can really help her kill a lot of heroes that would otherwise escape from death almost every single time. Then there's heroes like Clinks who can sometimes profit from the item as well, since he does need a moderate amount of mana and has no ability to kill heroes with built-in escapes such as invisibility, blink, leap, or heroes who can stun and then run away. Even a hero like Nature's Prophet can profit from Orchid, since he's a right-clicking intelligence hero and he can be anywhere on the map, making Orchid more or less a globally placed silence against one hero. Perhaps Broodmother should be included in this list as well, since at various points for the hero, Orchid was the favorite item due to her big mana needs and lack of lockdown other than a weak slow. And past that, There are very few heroes in Dota who can get Orchid early enough to justify its usefulness, need the stats it provides, and don't need something else with more importance. Sure, many strength and agility heroes lack lockdown, but very often they won't need the plus 25 intelligence or mana regen, not to mention a silenced enemy can still walk away from them. They'd much rather pay much less gold for an Echo Saber to cover their small mana needs while providing slow and damage, or they can buy a cheaper Basher that can stun opponents preventing spells and movement. I mean, Orchid doesn't even provide them that much damage, it's only plus 30 damage and 30 attack speed, which is pretty much the same as a cheaper Shadow Blade. You can always justify some aspects of an item purchase, but the important question is always, is there something better? And yes, Orchid does have an upgrade now, Bloodthorn, which makes Orchid have the stats of both an Orchid and a Crystallis, a plus 30 damage item, with a 20% chance to crit for an extra 75% damage. The main benefit of the upgrade though is the new Bloodthorn active. It's still a silence and it still lasts for 5 seconds, but the real benefit is that using the Bloodthorn active enables True Strike for the target, making evasion or mischance worthless, and any physical attack against the target automatically crits for 45% more damage. So naturally at the end they still take the magic nuke for 30% of the damage dealt during the duration. It's by all means a better active disable than Orchid. But the issue with Bloodthorn, while the item is very tempting, are the same as Orchid. The active is still very countered by all those items we mentioned before, and it's also currently the most expensive item in Dota 2 at 7,195 gold. So by the time you find your way to that much gold, I can just about guarantee that your opponents are going to have a solution to your Bloodthorn. If they have a Dispel or Black King Bar, all they have to do is use those items before the 5 seconds is up, and they won't take the additional 30% of damage dealt. So this item often gets heavily countered as the game goes on. And even if it doesn't, it's often better to spend that 3,100 gold on an item that replaces your bottle or magic wand slot. That's going to make you a lot stronger. So if you're looking at the big price tag on Bloodthorn and buying it for disable, it might be appealing to consider a side device purchase if you're an int hero, since that gives a 3.5 second hex. Or if you're a melee hero, spending 6,400 on an Abyssal Blade, since that lets you bash enemies or use the active to stun them for 2 seconds. That's a lot of disable that's harder to counter and will often do more in fights than Bloodthorn would have. Now some heroes do often purchase the item though, such as Templar Assassin, who loves to get her right-click damage multiplied as well as disabling opponents, and it's also often purchased on heroes like Clink, Storm Spirit, and Queen of Pain. They buy it very often, especially if they have to deal with evasion. It can be a really worthy upgrade. There are even times in an ultra late game situation where buying an Orchid or a Bloodthorn can give your team a huge advantage, especially if your opponent never got around to purchasing either a soft Dispel item or a Black King Bar. It's even great against Roshan, since it ensures everyone's attacks get a critical strike for 5 seconds. There's a lot of great items in Dota 2, Orchid being one of them, but there are some very specific circumstances where it's worth getting. Newbies be warned and keep an eye on what your opponents are building. That way you can have your Ghost Scepter, Glimmer Cape, or Black King Bar ready when the Orchid comes out, so you can make them feel stupid for buying it late in the first place. Thanks for watching.